Welcome to Inside the Issues, Affordable Housing in Arizona. I'm Jessica Bain, your host for this important, in-depth discussion about housing in our state. Whether you rent, own, or are still searching for the right place, housing is a story that touches every single Arizonan. Our state has always been a place people come to build a life. We have growing cities and plenty of room to spread out. But Arizona is on a fast track toward change, and housing is a big pressure point for many of us. Today, we're going to ask experts about the realities of our tight housing market and the dwindling supply of affordable housing. We'll get into whether there are enough homes to meet demand and why buying a home has become more difficult. We'll dive into the policies that influence home prices, the impact of zoning and land use on home building, the challenges of financing and lending, and the realities of displacement and gentrification. This is our third Inside the Issues show, made possible by the Citizens Clean Elections Commission. And I want to bring onto the stage the Executive Director of the Commission, Tom Collins. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Jessica, for hosting today's program. And thank you all for joining us for another edition of Inside the Issues. Clean Elections was created by Arizona voters to provide nonpartisan voter education and help Arizonans make informed decisions at election time. Inside the Issues is another way we help voters understand the issues that will shape the choices that they'll make at the polls. In recent episodes, we've talked about water and education, and today we're turning to housing. In our most recent statewide poll, affordable housing was one of the top issues Arizonans told us they care about. This year, Arizona voters will elect a governor, members of the legislature, local officials, and many others. The people they elect will make decisions that affect housing in communities across our state. So today, we brought together a panel of experts to help explain the issues, the choices, and the trade-offs. Jessica, thanks. Let's get started.
Let's do it. Housing accessibility and affordability are at the center of today's discussion. We'll get into how demand is outpacing growth and whether all of the apartment and home building we're seeing around town is actually making a dent in the problem. And we can't have this conversation without exploring whether our wages are lagging behind housing costs. Some say external factors like mortgage rates are to blame for the stalled market, but is that the whole story? It goes without saying that our most vulnerable neighbors suffer the most extreme consequences when affordable housing disappears. We'll look at eviction rates, the breadth of our unhoused population, and the struggle to regain housing once it's lost. Joining me today is a panel of housing experts who have a pulse on Arizona's housing dynamics and who will shed a light on all of this and more. So let's welcome our panelists. Gabriel Jaramillo, Director of the Healthy Communities at Vitalyst Health Foundation. Mark Stapp, the Fred E. Taylor Professor of Real Estate at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. Jason Barclay Morris, founding partner at the law firm Withy, Morris & Barr. And Tina Tamboer, housing analyst for the Cromford Report. Thank you all for being here. And you know, I don't think we can begin this conversation without talking about how we got here, because Arizona had a reputation for a long time of being a super affordable place to live. Mark, I want you to start us out. What happened?
Well, this goes back to at least the Great Recession and the run-up to what became the cause of the Great Recession, which was this big housing bubble. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of reasons why that housing bubble occurred, but the net effect was we built way more houses than we needed, and it got to the point where it crashed. And when that happened, right, home building across the country, this didn't affect just us, but it affected the entire country. Home building across the country pulled back. Capital markets pulled back, and we were not building then because there was a concern about our ability to support housing and be profitable. Mm-hmm. And so we underbuilt. That was the reaction to it, is we grossly underbuilt for more than 10 years. And that caused this structural deficit in housing that we have now. And just as we were starting to come out of that, right, slowly but surely, we have a pandemic. And then as we start to recover from the pandemic, we get inflated interest rates, right? And so these things, just one on top of the other, have compounded this problem to the point where it's now a very difficult problem to undo.
Absolutely, and Gabriel, Mark's talking about, we obviously have higher home prices than we've had in, well, ever, and it's harder to find apartments. There's all of these different impacts of what Mark has just explained. But for some of us, this is a frustration. For other people, it is like a legitimate, like life-changing situation. Who is left most vulnerable when our markets look like this?
Really what we're seeing is the need for workforce. So when we say the most vulnerable, it is the majority of, well, a vast amount of our workforce. So we're talking our teachers, our firefighters, our police officers, restaurant workers, those individuals that either are single income families, and then we're also seeing a significant increase in our seniors entering homelessness for the first time. And for the first time in their lives, they're experiencing difficulty paying rent and making those decisions between healthcare and covering the cost of housing. So it's putting them in those situations where they have to make those choices. So those populations are being most affected by rental increases, mortgages, house prices that are significantly higher, fixed incomes. They're seeing the most impact right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jason, something I hear a lot is, well, I see apartments being built everywhere. How could we possibly have a supply problem? What would you say to that?
And that's a fair observation, unless you look below and at the next layer, and that is, who are these apartments being built for? At what level are we seeing the boom in multifamily construction or the homes that are available? That's not at every level. They really are targeted to either the higher end. I mean, it's been a while since I've seen an apartment community that has described itself as anything other than luxury. So we need to be cognizant about building at every level and for every price point.
It's a very good point. This is not a one-size-fits-all housing market. It probably won't take a one-size-fits-all solution.
Precisely.
Tina, we've talked about how we came out of the recession. We're starting to catch up. We're seeing some home building. Bring me to today. What does the market look like by what you're seeing in the data? Is it healthy? What does the market look like?
Okay, so what we track at the Cromford report is MLS resale data. And our numbers are showing that our supply for this time of year is in a normal range. It is our demand that is a little bit below normal, so about anywhere from 10 to 15% below normal. That's putting us in a slight buyer's market. How it's coming out in the actual marketplace is those properties, those price ranges that are very sensitive to mortgage rates, as was discussed, have been gliding down. The ones right in the middle are pretty stable, and the upper end, which does not rely on mortgage rates so much, more on asset appreciation, those are doing quite well. So there is a bit of a bifurcated market here. To the point of retirees and older individuals, there have been studies to show that at the end of our working life, the vast majority of us have most of our wealth in the home we own. And so those who are retiring as renters were some of the most vulnerable people when we saw the rent increases of 2021. So focusing on that aspect is a good thing.
That makes sense. Mark, I'm hoping you can talk to the difference between the supply that is available. We have lots of homes on the market, and maybe the supply that people want.
Well, economists talk about the recovery that we've been undergoing as a country as a K-shaped economy, meaning the upper end of the market's doing very well, and you continue to add supply at the upper end. It's easy because you can be profitable building that kind of home. But the side of the market that we're really most concerned about, that Gabriel was talking about before, is the one where it's very difficult to build additional supply in order to house those workforce housing needs, right? The people that need those units. And so it's the tale of two cities. It is not the same if you are a wealthy or fairly well-to-do person. And we see that even, Tina, in the statistics for existing home sales, if you look at the difference between the average and the median, right, they are greatly different. And the reason they are is because it is skewed so much to the upper end. And when you look at that median, it's like bouncing along here, but you've seen the average going up and up and up and up and up because we're building to the upper end. We're not building the houses for the people that really need them, that have trouble affording them.
Yeah, Gabriel, tell me about the missing middle. That's a big conversation, a topic of conversation right now.
Absolutely. The missing middle has been in the news and legislation as part of the conversation with legislators and local officials for several years now. But essentially it is trying to find a way to build, to diversify the type of housing that's a little more dense. When we talk about duplexes, triplexes, quads, things of that nature, potentially in single family neighborhoods where it's appropriate to see a little bit more density to provide a range of affordability that's not a single family detached with a large yard. There's individuals in the workforce that are looking for something maybe a little bit smaller, an entry level home. So it really is that missing part that Phoenix and Arizona hasn't kind of embraced like other cities, other larger cities or transit-oriented development, transit-oriented communities, but it is that missing piece that Arizona is kind of missing out on right now.
Yeah, Jason, are we seeing any of that being built right now? And if so, where?
You know, we've got a toolbox full of solutions, whether it's ADUs, these accessory dwelling units, the missing middle, conversion of office to residential or commercial to residential. Where the rubber meets the road is the ability to get that done and to go build those things. And unfortunately, there are more impediments than solutions. So you have to solve, as a builder, you have to solve for what the neighborhood reaction is going to be, what the political reaction is going to be, what professional planning staff may think of the plan. And then you have to accommodate the fact that these best ideas still take 2 years to actually implement. So there isn't a quick solution. There are solutions available, but what we're seeing is all of these things being used in various places across the valley. So there's probably a great example that you can point to on any one of these solutions, but doing them at scale isn't occurring. They're somewhat one-off developments.
That's interesting, and I definitely want to get into some of the legislative ideas behind how to solve for that. But first, Tina, can you tell me where we are seeing a lot of the growth, at least in the valley, on the outskirts of town?
Yes.
And I wonder, with a first-time home buyer, would you tell them to maybe change their expectations of where they're going to live or the kind of housing they're going to have? Like, how do you balance those things?
Well, we have, well, first of all, let's just talk about the fact that Greater Phoenix has been in a growth state for at least 30 years or longer now, and there are stages of development. Okay, so the first stage is what we call population stage, where we just start building houses out there. It's really inconvenient to live there. There's no freeways, there's no jobs, there's no entertainment. Okay, so that's your population. Then we get infrastructure. Once the infrastructure starts going in, the freeways start getting in, it gets more popular. And then the jobs start coming into the area. First, it might be low-end jobs and then higher-end jobs. And then you start getting entertainment and an airport and all of that. If we look at Phoenix, where we are today, we have gone through all of those stages as a metropolitan area. The 90s were infrastructure. We've got, the job growth, the low-end job growth, call centers and all of that were probably the early 2000s. Then we get into our higher-end employment coming now, and now we've got our airport, where we have direct flights to Taiwan and to Paris and to London. And so when you look at those same stages of growth and you apply it to individual territories like the outskirts of town, you're going to have your established areas that many people want to live in, and then you're going to have the less expensive ones like Pinal County, where they're just on the verge of their infrastructure stage. They've been in population stage for a long time. There are a lot of plans for those freeways. So say, for instance, you can get a brand new home in Coolidge right now for under $300,000. Is it convenient to go to work? No, No, it isn't. Probably the same place Chandler was in, like back in 2003, you know? So when that freeway goes in that they're planning, that area is going to become very popular because it's going to be easier to get to work. So those are the things that when you're a buyer looking at those areas, you have to have a longer time frame that you want to live there. So probably instead of 3 to 5 years, you need to plan to put down roots at least 5 years, possibly 10, because you have to wait for all of that new home development that keeps adding to supply, that keeps your property values from rising too heavily to start filtering out, if that makes any sense. So it really does depend. If you have a budget, you might get for your budget as a first-time home buyer a condo in the center of town or a full-blown 3-bedroom, 2-bath home with a yard and a garage out on the outskirts of town. And that is something that is up to you, whether that fits your lifestyle that you want.
Yeah, I wonder, is it possible to get anything in a more affordable space in Central Phoenix anymore? Is that even possible with financing, with lending? Anyone?
I mean, all things are possible, but you're looking at parts of the valley, if you're going to find that, that housing, that are probably significantly underserved, and the house probably needs a significant amount of work, right? So can you buy it? Do you want to live in it? What needs to be done in order to make it livable? But it's really, really hard, right? We're an adolescent metropolitan area, to Tina's point, right? We are changing, and the only way that we're going to be able to adapt to these economic forces that we pride ourselves in, TSMC and all this job growth and everything else, is we have to densify. We cannot accommodate our growth on the periphery because we have significant constraints on the periphery. And so we've got to be able to densify, and that is a political and an economic and a financial challenge because it doesn't fit with the view that most people have of what we should be as a place. And unless we can accommodate this kind of growth, the missing middle, higher density in the inner city area, we're not going to be able to accommodate our potential.
And I want to talk more about the density, the politics of density very soon. But first, Gabriel, can you tell me about the different challenges that other parts of our state have? Are there different challenges in rural Arizona that we should be paying more attention to?
Absolutely. And some of the bigger concerns that we hear from rural Arizona are around workforce. So it's very similar when we talk about our health communities out in the rural counties, employing doctors, nurses, teachers. That seems to be the biggest obstacle. When we talk to underserved communities in our rural areas, you hear housing and childcare are the two biggest concerns. And how do we find a way to do that? And like Jason had mentioned, I'm a huge fan of more tools in the toolboxes. There's not a single answer. There's not a single policy that's going to address this. But making sure that we have those tools that make options available for development and addressing a variety of health concerns and needs that fit the needs for our community. That's how we solve this. And our rural communities are very similar. We've had conversations about regional structures, addressing housing because there's so many areas that are facing similar concerns from one city, from one town to another. And they're now trying to start to get together to figure out how they partner with the local housing authority, their local health department to try to find a way to address these concerns.
Let's get into the political discussion, or at least the policy discussion, because we do want voters to come away from this understanding just how much state and local decisions impact housing. It's easy to just talk about interest rates and things of that nature, but there are so many local decisions that impact the affordability, the accessibility of housing, where we build, how fast we build. There have been a lot of I would say, modest bills that have attempted to solve for our affordability problem over the past several years. Things like the ADUs, the casitas in the backyard, things like that. I'd love to hear from each of you whether you think anything we've done in the post-pandemic legislatively has moved the needle.
First of all, I would say all of the legislation and the rationale behind the legislation is well intended. But as I alluded to earlier, there are so many steps in the development process that sometimes good ideas don't get implemented, or there isn't the impact. It doesn't move the needle as much as you would like it to. The legislation that we've seen, I would first point out that the best place for land use decisions is at the local level, because frankly, it's very difficult for a state legislator in a rural area to understand some of the issues that are facing center city urban areas. And that goes doubly true at the federal level. But the individual pieces of legislation that we've seen do have an impact. The ADUs, I think, have probably been more utilized. The idea of having this accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, or sometimes in your front yard, depending upon your lot, it has sort of caught fire, more so than some of the other legislation that we've seen. And it happened at the city level, frankly, before it happened at the state level. So there were council members in Phoenix who were very interested in making this happen. And I think the testament to how successful it's been is there have been development companies, small developers, who have built their business model around just ADUs.
Right.
And that, to me, is a sign of success. Now the question becomes, who's living in these ADUs? Are these ADUs a solution to the housing issue, or is it a great yoga studio and home office, which isn't the impact that we're looking for?
Or is it a short-term rental? Tina, one of the things that I hear a lot about is that, investors and short-term rental companies, or private citizens who want to become a short-term rental company, that they're taking up a lot of our housing stock. Does the data support that?
Well, it depends on the season. So if tourism is down, guess what? They end up going into supply for long-term rentals. They flip back and forth depending on whether we're in our peak season. But as far as what has actually moved the needle, the one thing I can say specifically on resale is the increase in apartments. So the incentives for more apartment units to be built has had a direct effect on the cost of purchasing a condo, and that cost is going down. And so when you look at the effect of an investment in condos right now, that is a pretty strong drop in values. And so you have to be careful with your policies that if you're going to be incentivizing the building of more units, if you go over that, then you're going to have a lot of people who currently own that their values are going to start going down, and nobody wants that either, because that means you're going to have more underwater, they can't get out of the home as well. I feel that if we're going to focus on something, I focus on the no housing unit left behind, if you will, where the housing units that are being left behind right now are aging condos, and they're suffering with roofs that need to be replaced, that these things catch up to people. A lot of the people who buy condos think, I'm not going to live here long enough for us to have an assessment for a roof, or for paint, or for upgrading of your irrigation systems and things like that. So they start to catch up, and then you start to see people who can't pay them. You have HOAs having to raise their dues due to insurance issues that are caused by roofs being old. And so little things that could be implemented to help some of these communities, which, by the way, are being, they're housing our first-time home buyers, they're housing our retirees that are either single or sometimes married, but people in their retirement ages. That is the segment of the population that needs the most help, and they are residing in aging condos. So I would say maybe we save our existing aging units instead of just saying, well, forget them, we're just going to we're going to build a bunch of new ones.
That's a fascinating situation with the HOA politics of condos as well. Gabriel, condos are one part of missing middle housing, but there are many. It can take many forms. I know that there was legislation passed that was meant to encourage more missing middle housing by allowing it in more places. Is that enough? Is allowing it enough to spur that development?
I think it's one of the pieces that's needed. By itself, most likely not. There's the financing piece of it. There's the local policies and procedures at the departments that allow that process to happen, for those developments to happen. But policy is layered, and we see that come through, and without local participation in those and being intentional about it, and I'll use the city of Phoenix because I participated in it, but the land use, the general plan, to set the framework up. One of the pieces of the general plan is to identify centers, cores, and corridors. So the city can begin to identify these areas and lay the framework for policy that could then implement text amendments at the local code to allow that missing middle to be developed in an area that's identified throughout the city as a transportation corridor, as an economic development center, a business center, whatever that may be, where we know we're going to need additional units gradually or appropriately, but we've set that framework up in policy to allow us and allow developers to go to that area and say, this is going to be hopefully an easier application for density, for development, and have those conversations with the residents and the city to allow that. So it's a layered approach, and then we see implementations of state law in that interaction. So the adaptive reuse that was mentioned earlier, that is now allowed citywide, which is great. And if you can kind of layer that baseline framework with the general plan, looking at local zoning, and then maybe an opportunity zone on top of that, is that those tools in the toolbox that'll allow that to happen. But making sure that process internally, internal cities, is efficient will make that happen as well.
Yeah, zoning is obviously one element of this. I think financing is a whole other animal that the legislature so far has not addressed in a holistic way. What needs to happen on the policy side of things to make it possible to make affordable housing possible to build?
So let me go back and address the bigger question, right? Which was, are any of the most recent pieces of legislation having an effect? And the answer is, not really, okay? I mean, we're talking about tiny marginal impacts, right? Impacts on the edges of this. It is not going to solve the problem. There's not one piece of legislation that's been passed that is going to have a profound impact. They nibble at the edges, period. Hard stop. That's not solving the problem. These are all supply side attempts at solving the problem, and most of them are politically pretty easy, right? That's because that's how they got to be pieces of legislation that were passed. Financing is a big part of it, and the federal government doesn't control that, right? If you're talking about home mortgages, you're more closely tied to 10-year treasuries, and those treasuries are tied to policy and how investors view what's happening in the country, right? If you're talking about bond rates, you're talking about 30-year treasuries, and that is a bigger look at the long-term view of what we are as a country, right? And both of them are up very high. So there's not a lot of good feeling about the future, either short-term or mid-term. And those have impacts on the interest rates. We also lack tools. Arizona in particular had the least number of economic development tools of any state in the nation, period. There's a piece of legislation that was just passed which helps deal with this, and it has to do with infrastructure finance. But it by itself is not the panacea. What it does is it shifts those costs to buyers long term, right? And that allows the builder to better afford to be able to build those houses. But this takes years to occur. Every one of these things, as Jason had mentioned, you're not going to see effect of this stuff for a long time. The other part of this, when we talk about entitlements, is we have a tendency to focus on zoning, general plans, and things like that. You have building codes, and you have people within cities and towns that implement building codes, and each one of the cities has their own building codes. And so when you have a building code, the commercial code versus the residential code, and you're applying the commercial code to duplexes and fourplexes, you're just increasing the cost of building those things without any market impact on safety or quality, right? And so it is way more complex than some of these pieces of legislation. You know, we've got 120-some thousand estimate shortage. in the state. We have 60,000 unit shortage in metropolitan Phoenix. Adding 2,000 units, maybe at best, a year, isn't going to solve this problem when we continue to grow. And you can turn on the demand side of this equation very quickly. But it takes years to add additional supply. And when that happens, all you do is push rents and prices back up again because you have a supply and demand imbalance. It's hard to get out of this.
Tina, do you agree with that?
There was a lot going on there.
Oh, no worries. Do you, I apologize.
Anything specific?
Do you agree that we have a shortage?
Well, I can tell you that the data that we are tracking now does not act as if we are in a housing shortage. So any seller who puts their home on the market today is not going to feel that. The things that you see in a housing shortage is a line around the corner, like in 2021, where they had 5 minutes to look at the home before they could write an offer. That is a severe shortage of homes. And of course, that was fueled by low rates and a lot of demand coming in. So you have lower times on the market, you have rising prices, you have no concessions to the buyer. They're not paying, the sellers are not offering to do repairs. They're not, you know, there could be a cat rescue and be like, we'll take it, 5,000 over. You know, that's what we call dump your junk season. If you've got a less than perfect home, you put it on the market in one of those situations. Now what we're seeing is sellers, we have well over 50% in the sweet spots between 300 and 600,000. You've got 60 to 70% of sellers offering concessions to the buyer where they're paying them up to $10,000 median to pay down for rates, to pay all their closing costs, plus repairs. They are very amenable. That is not a low supply situation. Their days on the market are closer to 30 to 60 days on the market, and they have to be in perfect condition. The buyers are like, they don't need to buy a home that has a funny little smell to it. You know, they can go down the street and find one that's better. So what you see is in this type of market, your supply will start to rise because those not so perfect homes stay on the market, while the better priced, in excellent condition homes are sold. So right now, our prices are flat. We're not seeing appreciation. We're not seeing the days on market go down. So the market is acting as if it is in a mild buyer's market, not a crash situation, but just a buyer's advantage. That's where we are today. Not to say we won't experience, if rates were to come down, to see all of that demand go back up and we'll get a better feel for things. But when the prices of homes or rents go up, people consolidate. So say, for instance, let's take the rental market, for instance. You have people living in their own one unit per person, right? The rents go up, they start 2 people in 1 unit or even 3 people in a 3-bedroom unit. That leaves vacancies in the rental market. So you'll see the vacancy rate go up and the rents come down. When they get down to a better space, then guess what? People start splitting off and getting their own rental again. The similar situation with houses. You know, they consolidate, and then when things get less expensive, kids move out of their parents' homes, you know, people start to buy second homes, things like that.
Yeah. So let me just add one thing to
please.
this, right? So that's the existing home market.
Yes.
We are at equilibrium, which is why we have the conditions we are. Any additional demand, right? So our population growth fell off last year, right? To 68,000. We expect it to maybe be somewhere in the mid-70s this year. So if you take 75,000 additional persons that we add to our population, average 2.5 persons per household, you can be 2.3 to 2.7, somewhere in there, it yields a demand for 30,000 new housing units. Our permits right now, permits for single-family homes were off 21% through the first half of this year. When you look at what the expected number of permits is going to be for this year between multifamily and single-family, it's 30,000. Right? So the builders are building just what we need. If you all of a sudden have TSMC or some of the other effects economically occur, there's a population demand because of an employment demand we can't accommodate it without causing a shortage. And so that's why we stay where we are.
No, and that makes sense. And I think, Jason, it begs a larger question of how do you encourage development before that need is so significant that you create this 2021 situation we had?
That's an ideal question. And it's interesting because both Mark and Tina are right. They're not saying exactly the same thing, but you can actually, if you look at the entire market, you can understand why both of their answers are correct. Something that Mark just said was talking about the amount of housing, the need, the demand side, our population influx, what that attributes in terms of the number of units we need. The problem with all of these statistics is that they're not occurring at the same time in terms of the development cycle. So we just heard we need 30,000 units and we'll pull 30,000 permits. But those 30,000 permits aren't going to turn into 30,000 housing units for 12 to 24 months. So we are chasing, and that goes to your question, so how do we incentivize the building? It's going to be profitability. These are businesses. These are not charities, by and large, who are trying to fill this void. And if they don't believe that they can get that return, they're not going to start a 2 to 3 year process in the hopes that these numbers work. So one of the things we suffer from in terms of housing statewide is that oftentimes developers are reactive. They're not proactive because there's tremendous risk in being proactive, guessing where that market will be.
Gabriel, is there benefit in having the state, I guess, maybe take on some of that risk in the form of, providing incentives to make it a little more palatable to build these types of projects that we're talking about ahead of time, ahead of demand?
Both the federal and the state government play a role in that, and we've seen that over the last couple of years. Our biggest tool for specifically affordable housing development is the low-income housing tax credit, and we've seen that utilized. Now it's in a different status at the federal level, which I believe was increased another 15% at the federal level. At the state, it's a little more difficult. At one point, we had the state low-income housing tax credit applications and the housing trust fund. So we've seen the state and federal agencies play a role in addressing specifically those lower income households that need a subsidy or a program that allows that, and for transitional housing, HUD and the continuum of care funding for transitional housing. So yes, the governments play a role in helping that, but a lot of it comes down to, again, local policy, where we see the land available for multifamily development. That process and those costs and the time gets transferred to the developer. Even a nonprofit developer or an affordable housing developer that is utilizing those tools, like the low-income housing tax credit, that gets transferred onto them, extending the time, increasing costs. So we see that transfer to either the renter or need for higher subsidy in the form of more funding from the general fund, from either the city of Phoenix. Now we've seen local governments get involved. Tempe has the Hometown for All fund that allows some subsidy for development of affordable housing or mixed use, and the City Phoenix Council just approved, I believe it's $15 million for a housing trust fund that they're starting to incent those types of developments for those lower incomes. So yes, there is a role to play in incentivizing the development of affordable housing. We just need other solutions as well.
And I'd also point out that even with all the financing tools available, the first thing you need is a piece of dirt to go build these things on that's appropriately zoned. And the battles that we've seen at the local level in trying to make that occur, especially for low income, trying to move those cases forward is a Herculean task. But I've been working for 2 years with a neighborhood to get 74 units built at this point, which is a drop in the ocean. Yeah. So it gives you a sense of some of these barriers.
Yeah, time is money is what I'm hearing, first of all, and neighborhoods are making you take more time.
Yes.
How has density become this political football, Mark?
It's lifestyle, it's fear. Quite frankly, right? They're going to those people, though you hear this all the time, is those people, they're going to steal my cat, or it's going to cause traffic and they're going to run over my kid. You know, there's such a distorted sense of who lives in apartments. And this was quite a long time ago, but there was a mayor at the time, a woman in Phoenix, and there was a line of people, and Jason, you will appreciate this, and they were just haranguing about this apartment complex. And she stopped like at the 12th one and said, I just want you to know that my daughter lives in an apartment, right? And so that's the problem is we have this, the collective we, right? So policymakers, unfortunately, and neighborhood groups many times have this view of renters as being not invested in the community. We forget that renters are voters also. And they are vested members of the community. They pay sales tax, they pay income tax, they vote. And it's an unfortunate mentality that holds up what is so critical to us being that affordable place again. And this is an economic development. It's not just if you have only a concern for your business as a business owner, you should be concerned about this, because you need housing for your employees that is going to yield a more reliable, happy, productive, healthy employee. That's just good for the whole region. But it's hard to get there when you have these mentalities that create these roadblocks. I mean, Jason, you can talk about this better than I can.
You've just described my entire career for the last 30 years.
This is what you do every day.
But has it got worse, Jason?
It has. The advent of technology has not made zoning easier. It has, I think it was a quote attributed to Mark Twain that a lie can make its way halfway around the world before the truth can pull up its boots. And Facebook, Nextdoor, every tool, the Ring network, every tool that allows neighborhoods to come together, which is a wonderful thing for a lot of public safety and just community issues, can be the death knell for a zoning case, because these things are posted about what's occurring and the amount of traffic and the type, as Mark said, those people, and it makes Gabriel's job as a planning commissioner very, very difficult, because these are human beings who aren't acting out of avarice. They're truly afraid. Yeah. Change is very, very difficult next door to you or in your neighborhood. And fear is a hugely motivating factor, but that can make solving a housing problem, project by project, almost impossible.
I was going to say, Gabriel, you and I are involved with organizations that provide funding for affordable housing.
Yes, sir.
It is so hard to get these projects approved.
It is.
You can speak about this as well as anybody, both being a planning commissioner and also being on that side of providing support for these.
And that's what we look for, not only at Vitalyst, but as a volunteer in my time at the Planning Commission at the local community level, is to have a voice for that other aspect of affordability. These are members of our community, so the work that I do is healthy communities. We want to see our firefighters, our teachers, as part of the communities that they work in. That builds a more healthy community. And that's one of the reasons I volunteer my time on the committee and the commission to hear these and be a voice for that, but also in the work so we can help move that work along to show that low-income housing tax credit property or that multifamily development is the place for, we're going to see firefighters, we're going to see those members of our community living in those areas. It's not those people, it's us, it's our community that lives there. And we hear that all the time at the commission on some concerns about what's going to do to the property, and I always say we have to participate, and that's what I try to do, is we have to participate in these processes to say, it's not some random person, it's my neighbor that needs that. It's my cousin or my friend that needs that affordable house to live because maybe they're just going through police academy and they need a place to live, whatever that may be. So we focus on that healthy community aspect where we can all live in the same area. Maybe not in the same single-family detached home, but in a variety of it, in a variation of it.
This is a regional problem,
Yes.
right? And
Statewide, really.
Yeah, no, it is a statewide
Statewide, yeah.
problem, and unfortunately, there's not equal participation in the solution when you look across the jurisdictions that make up the region. There's not, and I've chastised elected officials in the past because I call them economic free riders. They like the sales tax, they like the employment, they like all of they like the bed tax that comes with the resorts. They like all that stuff, but they don't want to provide the housing for the people that work in the stores, that clean the rooms, that work in the restaurants. And it's like, fine, go someplace else, but not in my community. And then they complain about traffic, right? And so, you know, there's got to be, when people talk about responsible growth, it's a trite commentary most of the time.
Well, and the issue that we're seeing is that somebody running for office today would listen to this conversation and they would agree wholeheartedly. This is something that everyone can get behind in listening to us and this conversation today in the abstract. When we're not talking about a particular piece of property, this is a great idea. When the particular piece of property is brought forward, those same policymakers and elected officials say, it's a great, it's a wonderful project. By the way, in my line of work, the last thing you want to hear from an elected official at a city council hearing is when they start complimenting the project, because you know the second part of that comment is going to be, but unfortunately, and I can't approve it here. It's terrorizing for these elected officials to stand in front of 50 members of their voting public and who are scared to death of a project moving forward and say, all right, I'll approve it here. It's great in the abstract, very difficult in the particular.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think let's take it one step further, demystifying who is renting, who are those people, and are they invested in our community? I think it's important to note that there are changing demographics as to first-time home buyers. So there's a lot more people staying renters for longer, isn't that right?
Yeah, and there have been just some lifestyle changes that have been evolving over the years, and one of them is the putting off marriage, for one. And so we've discussed before that purchasing a home traditionally is a team sport. And so the longer you put off, you know, forming a team, the longer it is for you to, you know, get to the place where you can actually afford a home. Because most of the ones now are, you're going to have to be a dual income or a little bit older, farther along in your career before you can get into some of these established homes. So not what we would call the non-family household, which is roommates or single individuals, that median income is more in line with rents. That does look like they are affording the rents at this point, but they're right there. You know, that's not overly affordable, not overly expensive. But those people, if you will, in their 20s or even, you know, in the older age groups, but specifically in the 20s, those are the ones that are, you know, it's just taking them longer to do almost everything. So there's also a lot of different definitions of a first-time home buyer. I know automatically when you're like, what's a first-time home buyer? Clearly somebody who's never owned a home, right? But in lending, and even in our own perceptions of ourselves, a first-time home buyer could be somebody who, hey, I got married to somebody who owned a home. I was married to them. I lived in a home that technically I owned as a married person. We got divorced. And now I'm buying my own home on my own, and I'm in my 40s, and guess what? I'm a first-time home buyer, right? And so it's really more of like a perception, because a lot of these are polls, like, are you a first-time home buyer? You know, or if you've got a couple where one is and one is not, are we counting them? So it's a kind of a messy statistic, if you will. And so again, in lending, it could be if you just lived in a home that was dilapidated for most of your life and now you're buying a home, guess what? You're a first-time home buyer too. So there's so many
Layers
different
to that.
aspects of it. Yes. So I would say that that's probably not as bad So a good friend of mine used to say it's never as good or as bad as you think it is sometimes. And so there's a lot of gray, a lot of nuance into those numbers. But overall, yes, if you are a married couple family, those are the highest earners. And right now, as of 2024, the median income was $126,000. And that is enough to purchase a home.
You guys, I think we could talk about all of this all day. Maybe have like a 5-day seminar next time. Next time. It'll be televised too. But I want to make sure before we go to kind of have a wrap up discussion here. I want each of you to tell me if when we are back here in 10 years on this show, what needs to have happened for you to say, yeah, Arizona solved, not even solved this problem. Arizona made a dent in this problem. Gabriel, you want to start us off?
That's a good question. 10 years from now, I would like to see more bipartisan legislation. That's something that is going to be extremely important moving forward. It's an issue that addresses every district, every city, every town across the state. So to have not only policymakers come together and discuss it and see how that's implemented at the local level to be translated to our communities. I would love to see more work at the local planning level, not only within the departments to kind of streamline processes to make it easier, but to kind of piggyback off of the policies that are already happening, build upon that so we can try to catch up to that curve. We might never estimate or be there, whatever that number may be, but we can hedge our bets on how we can approach that. So I would like to see, and it might sound funny, but working together both at the state level, at the local level, and then down to the community level.
Mark, what's your very quick take on a 10-year plan for us?
So I think recognizing the fact that we are a maturing metropolitan area and that maturation is going to result in a change in our urban fabric or urban form, which means we have to become much more dense. And a recognition by elected officials and policymakers that is what is going to have to occur if we want to remain as a vibrant economic place that's desirable. And there are a lot of changes along the spectrum of approval in financing that have to be accommodated if we're going to be successful. You don't do that, I don't think that we remain as a highly desirable economic place as we were. We're not as affordable. I don't think we're the kind of community. We don't want to be a commodity, we want to be a community. And to do that, we've got to accommodate these changes.
Jason?
I think I would adopt both of those answers, which are very good, but I would focus on the supply side. And in 10 years, if you could go in this state from dirt to development in 18 months, that is a sign of success that's going to address many of the ills that we talked about today.
And Tina, cap us off.
I think the next 10 years will not be like the last 10 years, and that we are going to be amazed at the evolution of Pinal County. One of the biggest influences on housing values is infrastructure. So the freeways that are planned for Pinal County, I think, are going to really make that area way more popular, and people will be like, oh, you're so lucky you bought in 2026, right? But also looking out at the 303 and the development that's planned out in the West Valley, they're gonna not look anything like what they look like today. And I believe that the people who did take the leap and they saved and they scraped and they accomplished the purchase of a home out there are gonna find that it was a good decision.
I'm very excited to see what Pinal County looks like. I think
Yes.
about that all the time. You guys, we covered a lot of ground here today. I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their expertise with us. Arizona's housing story is complex, and some of the data that we heard today, it was a little sobering, but it's also insightful and helps us make better decisions. And one takeaway I have is that this topic is top of mind for so many of us, and that a response is happening, maybe not fast enough, but on many fronts. And thank you who you are taking the time to learn about this issue today at a deeper level. I'm Jessica Boehm, our host for today's Inside the Issues, Housing Affordability in Arizona. Thank you for watching. The housing market can feel overwhelming, but the more you understand about what's driving it, the better equipped you are to make the right decisions for yourself and your family. If you are thinking about buying or selling, or just hoping to get a better grasp on this complex issue, we hope today provided something useful to take with you. And our partners and presenters of this forum at Clean Elections hope so too, including Gina Roberts, the Voter Education Director at the Citizens Clean Election Commission. Gina, what did you think of today's discussion?
Thank you, Jessica. I think voters learned a lot today. I know I certainly did. Housing touches all of us, and we hope today gave viewers clarity, more context, and maybe even a little reassurance that it's not just their imagination. The market is complicated. Candidates will be sharing their thoughts on affordable housing in the coming months, and we hope today's discussion makes you feel better prepared to vote on those ideas. We at Clean Elections will continue to bring this type of information to you, the voters. And you can find more information about Clean Elections, about debates, and how to participate all on our website. Our goal is for everyone casting a ballot to stay informed and involved.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you all. We hope you have a clearer picture on where Arizona housing stands and what it means for you.